Skews about 4 inches that way. Okay, here we go. This is the third lecture of 232. Third lecture on the brain. The cerebrum is what we're talking about. We've kind of worked our way through the lower parts of the brain, the spinal cord, medulla, and pons, and mesencephalon, and now we're up to the cerebrum, which is where we do all of our thinking and have all of our conscious thoughts and so forth. Let's just talk about some basic principles of the cerebrum, and they work like this. Each half of your brain gets signals and sends signals to the other side of your body. Okay? So all the feeling that you have from the left side of your body goes to the right side of your brain, and all of the motor control, all the signals to tell the muscles to contract on the left side of your body come from the right side of your brain. Okay? Outside of those things, which are really, I think, the most important things that our brain does for us, the cerebral hemispheres, the two sides, have slightly different functions, but really they're pretty much the same. And it's very difficult to get an exact correspondence between an exact function and an exact region of the brain. So these areas that I'm getting ready to show you of the brain are not exactly precise, but they're pretty close. The brain, as you know, is gray matter on the outside. The gyruses and the sulci, that's the gray matter of your brain. It's on the outside. But inside the brain, and most of the brain is gray matter, except for deep down inside of it, there are areas of white matter. Now, some of the white matter is up here in the cerebrum, where you'd think it would all be gray matter, but it's not. And those fibers, just so you understand what we're talking about when we talk about these things, they're referred to as association fibers that kind of associate. Sometimes they associate one side of the brain to the other. Sometimes they associate, like your eye muscles to your vision, to help you keep your eyes focused in the right place. Things like that. Commissural fibers, same as when you studied the spinal cord, the commissures are the areas where the fibers go from side to side. So, you know, we might think that standing up on one foot is just a matter of making our right foot do the work of standing up, but it's actually also the left side of our body that shifts the weight and helps us maintain the balance. So we have lots of communication between the two sides of the brain. Projection fibers sending the information up to completely separate areas of the brain. The two major commissural fibers, sets of side to side, are called the corpus callosum. If you've looked at your sheep brain yet, that's one thing you can always see very easily. It's the big white band that slopes forward like that. And the other one is the anterior commissure. I've got good pictures of those here in just a second. There's things called the basal nuclei. Now, basal nuclei is probably not the best term, I don't think, for it, but basically these are areas of gray matter down within the brain itself. So they're the thinking parts of your brain, except they're sunk way down in the brain, surrounded by white matter. White matter is just fibers. You know, they're axons going one direction, going someplace. There are usually a whole bunch of them. That's what makes it white, is the fact that there are no cell bodies in white matter. And so these basal nuclei, or cerebral nuclei, kind of direct our some of our subconscious activities. Doing a frontal section of the brain right here, you can see the two major commissural parts, the corpus callosum, we'll see that on the longitudinal view here in just a second, and also the anterior commissure. So these are the two main side-to-side commissural tracts that are going. Here's the internal capsule, which also carries signals up to the brain, and so forth. These are the other basal nuclei. I don't hold you to these things. The amygdaloid body, the putamen, the globus pallidus. I just think it's kind of too much. But the ones that we can see nicely on the midline sagittal section, you should know. The central sulcus, we've already talked about that. It goes over here on the side. Remember, it has the motor in front and the sensory in the back. And so let's talk our way through these a little bit. The precentral gyrus, this motor strip of our brain coming down here, it's going to direct all of our voluntary movements. The primary motor cortex is another name for this area of gray matter that's there just in front of the precentral gyrus. And pyramidal cells are these type of cells that you should be able to identify, and we have them under the on the microscope slides. Please understand pyramidal cells; they'll probably show up. Those are the primary neurons of the motor cortex, and they connect with a lot of other cells in order to make our motions smooth. Because clearly, we don't want to be twitching, and we don't want. It takes a whole bunch of motor fibers to make our arm move up, and we have to coordinate all those together. And that's why the pyramidal cells contact so many other cells. The sensory cells, on the other hand, are just behind. Remember the postcentral gyrus. That's in the parietal lobe, behind the central gyrus. And they receive all of our somatic sensory information. In other words, all the information from the outside of our body, it's coming in. Touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste. Taste. Taste is a special sense. We'll talk about that when we get to the chapter on special senses. And also temperature. Now this does not mean body temperature. This means the temperature of the outside. So you know whether it's warm or cold outside. So this primary sensory cortex is the surface of this postcentral gyrus. Now, we have a number of these areas of the cerebrum that have been plotted out. We know what areas of the brain do these different things. So here they go. The visual cortex, obviously, is the area that receives our sight input. Those things are picked up in our eyeballs, right on our retina, and our retina sends signals to our brain, sends it to the visual cortex. Auditory cortex is where we hear. Olfactory cortex is where we get the messages from our nose, which is where our olfactory cortex lives. And the gustatory cortex is from our taste buds, our taste receptors. Here they are. Once again, I kind of wondered how much of this is really all that important, but basically you do need to know the major lobes of the brain. Of course, the major lobes are the frontal portion up here, and here's the central sulcus. So here's the precentral gyrus right there, postcentral gyrus right here. Motor, sensory. Up here in the front areas up here is where a lot of motor association takes place. I think you should know that the occipital lobe back here in the back of your head is where the visual patterns are established. So we basically see with the very back of our brain back there. Auditory is right here, our hearing. Here's our gustatory, our taste. Here's our smell right here on the upper part of the temporal lobe. I think that's good enough for exact localization. I don't think I need to say anything further about that. We have an area called the GIA or the GIP, the General Interpretive Area, also called Wernicke's area of the brain. And this is the one that's, this comes back to that business we've mentioned before about being right-brained or left-brained. In other words, it kind of receives information from all the different sensory areas, coordinates them so that you can put it all together. So the GIP, the Wernicke's area, coordinates the access to complex visual and auditory memories. So obviously you've been to a band concert, you've seen the band play, you've heard them this is the area of your brain that allows you to process that. And of course, some people are thought to be more right brain and appreciate things like music and art, and then other people are felt to be more analytical and understand numbers and things like that more clearly. So this is one of those areas that can be on either side. It's only present in one hemisphere, however. The speech center is an important area because, and it's in the general interpretive area, and it coordinates all your vocalizing functions. I had a patient one time that had a stroke to his speech center, and he couldn't coordinate his words. He understood everything you said. He knew exactly what he wanted to say, and he could write very well and write out answers and statements, but he could not speak. And so you'd say, "Hey Harry, how you doing today?" Yeah. And how's the weather today? Well, it's yeah, uh-huh. He could not make his vocal cords, he couldn't coordinate them together, associated with his hearing, because you always hear whatever you say, to make that work. That's also important in the prefrontal area, the prefrontal cortex. A lot of abstract intellectual activities go on up there, and I think I'll just leave it at that. So here's your GIP, your general interpretive area, GIA. Here's your one of your eye fields, but remember most of your eye processing is done back in your occipital lobe. Speech center here, just in the prefrontal area, and then your prefrontal cortex up here. Please do not need to. You do not need to know these. Clearly, as science has progressed and as an anatomic understanding has progressed, the areas of the brain are much more worked out than they even were when this book was written. But the fact is, for purposes of this class, you just don't need to be that exact. This goes back to this business about lateralization of the two hemispheres, and this is the point that there's certain things are more on one side of the brain than on the other. This is the left brain, right brain thing. Please just know that this is very soft, and you can't really look at a patient and tell which side is their dominant side. Now, we used to think all you had to do was find out whether they're right-handed or left-handed, and it's still kind of soft. So I think I would just leave that at that. Most people are left brain dominant. Well, that's because most people are right-handed, okay? So if you're right-handed, you might think, well, the left brain, which of course controls the right side of your body, must be the dominant hemisphere, and that is true. The dominant hemisphere in general controls things like reading, writing, math, decision-making, speech, and language. And then the right hemisphere is more of the fluffy kind of things, if I could say that, not be insulting. Senses, touch, smell, sight, feel, taste, recognition, music, appreciation, all those kind of things. Another picture here, this is just a diagrammatic picture. Remember, you've got two things that carry the messages from side to side. The corpus callosum, the big one, and the anterior commissure, which is much smaller and down in front. So remember that the right eye sees, everything works opposite. Vision is a little complicated, we'll get into that later. Here's the writing, usually on the left side if you're right-brained, but yet you touch and feel and analyze on the other side. I think that's really all I want you to know about that. I think that's more than enough. What's a seizure? You've seen, anybody ever seen a seizure? What was it like when you saw it?
It's extremely hard to control.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I've seen the two types. One where they just kind of, the grandma
It's very still.
Very small. Yeah. Well, seizures, the thing you need to remember about seizures, that we used to call it epilepsy, which is really a bad name, as if it was a disease of its own. It is not a disease of its own. It's simply a symptom of some brain disorder, okay? So sometimes kids will get seizures when they get a high fever, for example. Febrile seizures are common. But basically a seizure generally starts, I like to think of it as an itch on your brain. So one particular area of your brain starts to fire over time, and it's firing off and firing off and firing off. And finally that area starts to spread and spread. So it may start off with one hand shaking and then one arm shaking, and then it spreads to your whole body. And when it does, that's called a grand mal seizure. And it's very obvious on an electroencephalogram, an EEG, or a brainwave test. We don't hold you to the chapter in the lab book on EEGs, but I do suggest you read it. There's just some basic, you ought to kind of know the basic waveforms of the brain, alpha, beta, delta, I believe. Anyway, so seizures are not as bad as you might think, although some people have tremendous numbers of them. They occur all day long. That's obviously a real problem. If you see somebody seizing, please do not ever try to stick a tongue depressor in their mouth or pull their jaws apart to keep them from biting their tongue and all that stuff. You can't overcome them. All you'll do is damage their mouth or knock a tooth or two out, so please just don't ever do that. They will stop in a few minutes. Usually in 2 or 3 minutes the seizure will stop, and then the patient will be very tired and sleepy. That's called the anyway, that's the recovery period. The word will come to me in a minute.
I had seizures once and I couldn't find what it was.
Yeah.
I was out to eat one day and I had a sip of my sister's soda, and I remember my mind blacked out, and it was like I was dreaming.
Yeah.
And I woke up and my dad's like holding my arms down, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "What? I don't know what happened."
Yeah.
It was just like strange.
Is that the only one you had?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to the hospital after, not like that day, but like a couple days later, and they just did blood work and that was it. And they were like, "You can't find anything."
Usually today you'd go through a $50,000 workup, which is pretty useless. You know, they do CAT scans and MRIs and a spinal tap maybe, and blood tests and all that kind of jazz. The fact of the matter is they did the right thing for you. If you only had one and it's never come back, they certainly did the right thing. Unfortunately, in modern medicine, there's very little thought given to how much money is spent on evaluating a lot of things, mostly because I think patients think they want to know the answers.
Right.
A lot of times it's better just
Right.
don't worry about it, you know, but most people won't buy that answer. Okay. All right, now the last thing in this chapter is entitled the cranial nerves. And the cranial nerves are something you need to know about. Now, here's the YouTube code. If y'all haven't watched the videos online, if you don't want to, you certainly don't ever have to. Let me go through the cranial nerves with you, and this is one thing I'm proud to say I remembered for 40 years. I learned this when I was in comparative anatomy, I think, in college, and I remembered it until I came back and started teaching at PCC 8 years ago, so that's a long time. All right, the cranial nerves are kind of interesting. There's 12 pairs of them. They all have names, they all have numbers. Their numbers are Roman numerals. So I'll just write that up here. I'm sure you're all, you know these are 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. Okay. On old Olympus's towering top, A Finn and German viewed some hops. Whoa. Yeah, I remembered that for 40 years. On old Olympus, Olympus is a mountain in Greece. On old Olympus, this is towering tops. A Finn and German viewed some hops. Hops obviously are what you use to make beer with. You got to grow them somewhere, and indeed they do. If you ever seen them growing down in the Willamette Valley, it's pretty amazing. They run them up strings about 30 feet in the air, and then they run the strings this way, and they're vine sort of things that run up there, and it's amazing. Okay, so before I go through the 12 of them exactly, just know that you can kind of classify them into different categories. Some of them are sensory, and all they do is carry information into your brain, so they are afferent. Some of them are special sensory. They carry special senses such as smell, sight, hearing, and balance. Some are motor. In other words, they make your muscles work, especially the muscles of your face and upper areas here. And the last ones are mixed, so they're both motor and sensory. So here's my mnemonic. One of my mnemonics is this one here. On old Olympus's towering top, a Finn and German views some hops. Now, what that means is, very clever here, and this is what still amazes me, that I think I can still do this without cheating and looking over there. On is the olfactory. Anybody know what olfactory means?
Smell.
Smell. Okay, so that's the first nerve is called the olfactory nerve, and it carries smell. The second one is the optic, and it carries sight from your eyes back to your brain. Number 3 is Olympus, which is the oculomotor. Well, what do you figure it does? Oculomotor. Yeah, it controls your eye muscles. And our eye muscles are really incredible. I don't know if you've ever thought about how incredible they really are, but you know, I can be looking at you and then look at you, and in a hundredth of a second my eyes can move over there and then refocus on you, then come back over here and refocus on him, and then look at my fingers and refocus on something really close. The muscles of our eye are unbelievable. Number 4 is called the trochlear. And the trochlear is, I'm going to list it with number 6 here. Number 6 is called the abducens. Abducens, what do you think abducens might mean? Abduct, remember? Abduct means move away from the midline. So indeed, the abducens nerve only innervates one little tiny muscle, and that muscle is the muscle that makes our eyes abduct. It's the lateral rectus muscle. When that eye muscle pulls the eye back, the eye looks out. Okay. The other one is the trochlear here, number 4. The trochlear also only innervates one eye muscle as well. It innervates the superior oblique muscle of the eye, which basically rotates the eye in that direction. We will go over the eye muscles carefully as we go through this. Number 7, the fin, is the facial. And what do you figure the facial nerve does? Well, if you think it makes you feel your face, that would be wrong. It makes you move the eye muscles of your face. It's a muscular nerve that goes to the muscles of facial expression, we call them. Makes you smile and so forth. Number 8 is an A, and it stands for acoustic. Now, this probably shows my age a little bit, but we don't call nerve 8 the acoustic anymore. Acoustic obviously means hearing, right? But we know now that the 8th nerve actually does 2 things. It carries both sound and it carries the vestibular information. In other words, the semicircular canals and those kind of things that give us balance and tell us where we are oriented in the world, which is up, which is down, things like that. So we call it now the vestibulo-cochlear nerve. I will accept acoustic. Either one, but just know that it does more than just hearing. It also does the vestibular, the equilibrium type things. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal. Now, what do you think the glossopharyngeal does? Glosso means tongue, okay? That's your glossus, that's your tongue, okay? And pharyngeal, your throat, your pharynx, okay? Your pharynx is the area of your back of your throat and your upper airway and your lower nose, which carries both food and air. So you breathe through your pharynx as well as you swallow through your pharynx. And obviously you know they're connected because every one of you has blown milk out of your nose before, right? So you know they're actually connected back there and back, but just something to think about. V is the vagus. The vagus nerve, number 10, is one of the really important nerves because it carries lots of autonomic fibers. In other words, fibers to make your heart beat faster, fibers to make your heart beat slower. Vagus nerve is called the vagus nerve because it means vagabond, and by that it wanders all through your chest and your intestines and almost all of the organs of your abdomen and your chest are mainly innervated by that one nerve. Now you'd think, well, it's a cranial nerve, you'd think it would just work up in your head. Well, the vagus is certainly an exception to that. Number 11 is called the spinal accessory. And sometimes they just call it the accessory nerve, but you got to get an S from something, and we used to always call it the spinal accessory, number 11. And number 11 is a nerve that innervates a number of muscles back here on the back of your neck and front of your neck too. It's kind of the nerves that make you go, that's the way Melissa always teaches it. It's the duh nerve, okay? Spinal accessory. We'll talk about which muscles that really innervates shortly. And the last one is the hypoglossal. And I just told you what glossal means. It means tongue, right? So hypoglossal sort of means under the tongue, but it's not really. This is the nerve that completely controls the movements of the tongue, okay? Now, so that's all 12 of them, and you probably ought to start memorizing them because you're going to need to use them, and you will use them all through your career, I promise you. The 12 cranial nerves will get tested every time you see a patient. You look in their eyes, you check their pupils. make sure their eyes can move correctly. You see, those are all just checking cranial nerves. Yeah?
I think you put that in the 5.
I did? Oh, I guess I did. Yeah, what is 5? It's the trigeminal. Thank you. Trigeminal is an interesting nerve. It gets its name because it has 3 major parts. Trigeminal does mainly the sensation of your face. So the trigeminal is what you feel with your face, and the facial, number 7, is what makes your face muscles move. Okay? Thank you. All right. Some say Marilyn Monroe, but my brother says Bridget Bardot. Well, that's a really simple little mnemonic that will help you remember that some of these nerves are purely sensory. The S's are purely sensory. The M's are purely muscular. All they do is make muscles contract. And the B means both. Okay, so they do both motor and sensory. Some say Marilyn Monroe, but my brother says Bridget Bardot. I think Bardot just died a few years ago, didn't she? These were the 2 sex kittens of the 50s and 60s that we dreamed about when we were 5 and 6 years old, I guess. Okay, so now let me just tell you that when we get to the quiz on the cranial nerves and we get to the tests on the cranial nerves, most of you are going to sit there and write 1 through 12 and write the letters and write the Marilyn Monroe thing across the top to help you remember this. And that's great. That's probably what you should do, is just find an empty piece of paper on your test, write this out, and then hopefully that will really help you in knowing them and so forth. Okay, so the 12 nerves are classified mainly by their primary functions, and that's the sensory, motor, or both. Some of them have secondary functions, and that would be, the example would be like the vagus nerve, which also serves, it's just a nerve, but some fibers of the autonomic system kind of jump on it and carry the autonomic, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic fibers down to the different organs.